Hello and welcome to the 8th edition of AviaDev Insights Africa Connectivity Update, the podcast offering an insight into the new route developments in Africa. I'm Jon Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa, a platform dedicated to supporting the development of new air routes to, from and within the African continent. We're just a few weeks away now from AviaDev 2024 in Windhoek. We've only got about 50 or 60 seats remaining at the event, and we already have 40 airlines registered representing most of Africa and also some international airlines as well. So if you want to join us, head over to aviadev.com and register for your spot today. Now, this podcast is your monthly roundup of the latest route development news impacting our great industry, including where routes or frequencies have been reduced or dropped. I can guarantee you will both be informed and entertained over the coming hour, as I've got two brilliant guests back with me to dissect the news and developments. As always, our stalwart Jon Mendis is here, joining us with his potent combination of pragmatic advice and brutal honesty. And for those new listeners, I don't think there'll be too many of those, but Jon is an AviaDev advisory board member, a good friend of ours, and also an av geek who brings over 20 years of experience in the industry, including experience managing airports, commercial airlines, and cargo airlines in Africa and the Middle East. Joining Jon for his second appearance is Dr. James Pearson, an accomplished route analyst and journalist at Simple Flying, and somebody that I've known for almost 10 years now, believe it or not. James has worked in academia, including spell at Coventry University, and also spent time at London Luton Airport as an analyst before embarking on a journalism career with Ana.Aero and now Simple Flying, where he delivers a simply brilliant weekly route newsletter. So do make sure that you subscribe to that. I'll put the link in the show notes. James also was responsible recently for a brilliant deep dive into Turkish's African network and their narrowbody experiences and their narrowbody advantages last month after our discussion on this podcast. So do check that article out as well. Now, the opinions you're going to hear today are strong and they are definitely our guests' own, but I'm sure you'll find out they are very much backed by compelling reasoning and analysis. So time to fasten your seatbelts as we start our taxi out. Welcome to the May 2024 AviaDev Insight Connectivity Update. Welcome to the podcast, guys. Great to have you back with us.
Thank you very much.
Always wonderful to be here.
All right, amazing. Let's get stuck right in with an airline that is actually a brand new carrier for Africa and an airline that I got to speak to a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. So you can go back. It's only 3 or 4 episodes ago. And that airline in question is Norse Atlantic Airways. Now, I know that both of you have listened to that podcast. You've also been very much involved, aware of the airline over its last couple of years since inception. So I'd like to get some feedback on the operation from you both. So to summarize for our listeners, they will be launching a 3 times a week operation from Gatwick in London to Cape Town International, commencing the end of October, which is the beginning, of course, of South Africa's summer. Jon, do you want to kick us off on Norse? What do you feel about these guys?
Well, let's start with Norse in general. Norse, despite all their denials, is basically the former Norwegian long-haul operation under a different name and paint scheme, down to even the fact that even some of the aircraft they operate are the same aircraft that they just had repainted. The main difference, though, between Norse and Norwegian is that Norse got hold of these aircraft at the absolute depths of the market back during COVID, where nobody wanted these. And by every account, they have absolute sweetheart lease deals. When Norwegian was being forced to fly very marginal routes just to keep these planes in the air and recover that ownership costs, Norse has the luxury of picking and choosing the markets they want to fly in at the right times of year and utilizing these aircraft smarter. And I think that is where the Cape Town route comes into it. Cape Town to London, I believe, was about 350,000 passengers in 2023. And that is more than double the next highest market from Cape Town, which was Amsterdam and Frankfurt are both in the 140, 150,000 passenger range. So London to Cape Town is basically, I would say, infinite demand, but as close to infinite demand as you have in long haul to Africa. But a bulk of that traffic happens over the northern winter, southern summer. Now, this fits perfectly for Norse because Norse's bread and butter traffic, as the name Norse Atlantic suggests, is flying from the Norse to the Atlantic. And that is very much a summer dominated market because, as nice as the Norse regions are in winter, there's only so many people who really want to fly to see Santa Claus in Lapland. And consequently, they have a lot of spare capacity that is underutilized, if not unutilized, during the winter schedule. That makes this a perfect match. It means that where you have a counter-cyclical market like Cape Town, which is crying out for capacity, right now, British Airways and Virgin Atlantic both have service in that market non-stop from the UK into South Africa. There is no South African carrier flying that market. Presently, South African Airways used to fly both from Johannesburg and Cape Town, but no longer do following their restructuring. But it's a market that if you're able to come in with the right marketing, you can make good money. And the demand over the winter season is definitely there for someone who's ready to put in the right kind of product. And Norse's product of low cost long haul. Although I think if you listen to the podcast, I think they'd be very keen to say they're not low cost long haul. They are high value long haul. You pay only for what you want. I think that's ideally suited for a highly leisure market such as Cape Town from the UK. And I think I'm optimistic. If you're going to enter any market from the UK in winter season, Cape Town is probably the best bet for you to do. So they're taking a bit of a leap of faith. It's a very different market than their usual North American markets, but maybe not as different as some people might think. Cape Town might as well be Europe.
Yeah, and I did ask those questions about why Cape Town, why not another destination that's a shorter sector, and those answers were given, and you've backed those up. There's a couple of things, James, I really want your opinion on this, but there's a couple of things as well that are particularly interesting. One is, as you've mentioned already, Sean, the actual configuration of the plane is premium economy and economy only on a 787. So it's very different to the kind of product, although not that much different to the product that most people fly on between Cape Town and London, but there isn't a business class or first class product. The second thing, James, is just from a network connectivity perspective. They admitted to me this is a point-to-point operation. They don't have any interlines, any code shares, any partnerships at either end, really. Okay, they've got EasyJet out of Gatwick, but in South Africa itself, not so much. So I'm interested to know how you feel this is going to develop and whether that's important, because we keep telling everybody through AviaDev, it's super important to have this feed into your international routes, and they've chosen to go it alone.
I think it's a very interesting development. I love Cape Town, my favorite city in Africa and possibly worldwide. Just before I answer, as you said earlier on, it's its first African flights, excluding its wet lease agreement with Air Peace to Lagos. And it's also its new longest route. Is really starting to try to tackle the massive winter problem that Norse and many airlines across the world have. To date, it's fair to say that this has done very badly, I'm afraid to say, because Norse introduced loads of 3 different Caribbean destinations last winter, and all of them have been removed. It simply didn't work. So this is its next stage to try to make winter work. And ultimately, this is going to determine whether it survives. I think it's quite interesting in a different way because it's one of only 3 airlines from Cape Town non-stop to Europe, which is actually during the day, not overnight. And of course, that'll help with aircraft utilization, but further knock yields and fare. I do wonder if it's going to be pushed back the start from October to slightly more of the peak winter season, summer season in the south. But that remains to be seen. I'm really skeptical about whether it's going to work and be sustainable because the majority of Norse's routes have seen frequency reductions, except for core places like New York. But I hope, just like Sean does, that it remains, that it is very successful. It should be decent. It's a very big market. Airfares with BA and Virgin non-stop are expensive, typically $1,500, $2,000, even in economy. And clearly they can stimulate the bottom end of the market with reasonably cheap fares on average. But I don't think they really need any interlining or any partnerships or any code shares, even if they have them. It's a very large point-to-point market, and they're only flying 3 times a week.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think in that market it makes sense. So, yes, Sean, come back to us.
Now, also when you mentioned on this interline, when you're flying into Cape Town, who is there to really interline with? You've got Airlink, and there's only a handful of destinations on ERJs. Cape Town is not geographically suited to be a hub for anything. It's literally at the bottom end of the world. And unless you're connecting onwards to Antarctica, which Norse did, they did fly from Cape Town to Antarctica last year. Props to them for that. But unless you're connecting to Antarctica, there's really not a logical connection point that you can do with Cape Town. I think on the northern end of the route, as James points out, it is a day flight. At the northern end of the route, they have access to virtual interlines with EasyJet's network, which basically is a fancy way of saying you're buying two tickets and someone else is buying your insurance policy. But yeah, the largest market from Cape Town is London. It's double the size of any other market. And the next two markets, the only two markets with 100,000 passengers other than London are Amsterdam and Frankfurt, both of which already have non-stops from Cape Town. So it's not like they're going to be tapping into a need for connections. They're going to be tapping into the premium leisure market, I think. That's going to be the tourists who enjoy wintering down at their winter home in South Africa. And they will pay probably for the premium economy instead of paying for BA Club and Virgin Upper Class. Those are steep fares. And I think Norwegian's premium economy gives you as good or better product than the BA's Travel Plus, especially on some type of aircraft where they still have the older products. And as well, they have a decent product in premium, but it comes at a steep price relative to what Norse is offering. So I think they've got a little niche. Again, time will tell whether they work or not, but on paper at least, this makes sense from the seasonality, from the pricing, from the potential market, from the scheduling, from everything. There's nothing I can really look at and say, oh, they should have done this instead. They're making the best with the resources they have, and I'm optimistic. I think it might work out.
Yeah, the Swallows heading south for the winter. Absolutely. Yes, James, please dive in.
Thank you. Just about the virtual interlining with EasyJet, Norse will get back at nearly 10 p.m. at Gatwick, so there will be nothing to connect to unless you stay over. So it will be 100% point to point. And that's pretty fine, low freeze. And I must say, to end on a positive note, I flew Norse a couple of years ago in premium economy, and it's actually very decent, to be fair, for what it is. And it doesn't really pretend it's something it isn't. So that's quite enjoyable.
Yeah, and it sounds like the fares, what Norse is starting with in a premium economy is what you're paying for economy in Virgin on BA. So I think there'll be a lot of people that will take that chance. It's obviously an established market. It's a big market. If you want to hear more, I spoke to Philip Allport, who's the SVP of comms at Norse. So you've heard it from these guys, but also from the horse's mouth as well. So yeah, go back and have a listen to that podcast. And while we're talking about EasyJet, we wanted to bring up a part of Africa that we don't talk about too much, which is Cape Verde or Cabo Verde, depending on your parlance. So talk to us about this, Sean. Like, what's the story? Because EasyJet are getting involved into Cape Verde now.
I think it's a natural progression. EasyJet has bases in Portugal, and Portugal has a lot of traffic into Cabo Verde. It's within the range of Airbus narrow bodies, which EasyJet operates. And therefore, at some point or the other, they're going to have to dip their toes into this market. But I think what's really interesting is that this could be the start of a trend, because hitherto we've seen, just as a little bit of trivia, the largest airline between Europe and Africa is Ryanair. And Ryanair almost entirely flies just to the North African coast, whether Morocco down to Egypt kind of area, and doesn't come south of the Sahara. But there's nothing which is actually going to stop the EasyJets and Ryanairs with the next generation of narrow bodies, whether that's A320neos or 737 Maxes respectively, from expanding into these markets. And I think that is something that we need to keep an eye on, and that we may identify this as a seminal moment in years to come, as in the first movement of a major European low-cost carrier into the sub-Saharan market using these neos/maxes. And I think Cabo Verde to Portugal is a very different market than, say, Lagos to London or something as such. But just in terms of dipping their feet into this market, I think it is a very interesting and noteworthy, rather than being an earth-shattering one. I think it's more of a just a prediction that we'll probably see more of these little niche routes, whether that's going to be somewhere in France into Dakar or maybe Banjuls or things as such over the next few years, or maybe even the next decade, as these markets mature and they can have more capacity and they need to find homes for it.
Yeah, I think from my side, I went a few years ago in the winter to Cape Verde on a holiday, probably 8-9 years ago now. And it was pitched as, hey, look, the weather's great even in the winter. So it's what you talked about earlier, James, this trying to reduce the seasonality fluctuations. So what do you think in terms of the route development? Are you as excited as Sean is that some of these markets are going to be opened up because of the new generation of aircraft?
I think it's pretty exciting. They're going to be flying from Sal to Porto and Lisbon, obviously completely VFR driven. The more exciting thing for me is that Porto is unserved. Lisbon has TAP and Cape Verde, but they're very expensive, of course, as you'd expect. And EasyJet's one-way fares are from $95, which is cheap as chips in that kind of market. So they should clearly massively develop it. And I expect frequencies to rise, and I expect them to add more Cape Verde islands from Portugal. I'm not so sure if they're going to, partly because of ASA reasons, going to expand elsewhere within West Africa and that kind of area. But this is a very good first attempt.
Yeah, I remember when I used to run these African route development events, I remember Vueling sending a big team down to Africa to look at this because of the aircraft that they had and their ambitions based out of Barcelona and what they were thinking to do. It's not brand new, but this is, like you say, it's quite disruptive, and it's what the EasyJet and Ryanair's have done on some of the more traditional trunk routes in mainland Europe. Now, if they're using Southern Europe as their jumping off point, they can access these North and potentially West African markets as well, based on access into the markets. Of course, as you say, James, that's always going to be a challenge. Senegal has definitely seen this, hasn't it, Sean, in terms of the struggles of connecting some of these destinations, and obviously keeping other airlines out as well has been a sort of feature. So I think that one's definitely one to watch, and it's definitely worth us mentioning. So let's move to Central Africa next, and let's have a look at Cameroon. So Cam Airco are going to open some routes from Douala to Brazzaville 4 times a week from the end of May with a 737-700. So Sean, I see you smirking. Thoughts on this one?
Yeah, Cam Airco is a very interesting airline, and I'll call it an airline because sometimes it flies, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it has some planes, sometimes it doesn't. It's a prototypical African government-run boondoggle. It exists for the purpose that someone has decreed it should exist, and for better or for worse, it seems to dominate the market in Cameroon for lack of any well-organized private sector competitor to it. Yeah, it is important, not because it is particularly well-run or because it does anything earth-shattering, but for lack of anybody else and the fact that there is the country that needs to be connected. Anything that grows roots within Africa is a good thing, but I'm well on the record by saying government-owned airlines digging deeper holes for themselves shouldn't really be considered positive activity. So let's see what happens with it. But given Cam Airco's long-standing record of doing things for no particular reason, failing at them, and then trying them all over again with a new wet lease aircraft in a couple of years' time, this is not something that is really going to change the landscape of Cameroonian aviation significantly one way or the other. These are markets that Cameroon has traditionally had connectivity from. These are markets where connectivity is very poor from right now. Adding connectivity in these markets is a positive. Now, sustainable, jury's out, but probably not going to vote to acquit.
Yeah, fair enough. And is Cameroon in your repertoire, James, your area of expertise?
Yeah. Yes, I can say a few things. Actually, Cam Air apparently served Brazzaville a few years ago until 2017. At least has some history that hopefully actually uses that effectively. The market had about 35,000 round-trip point-to-point passengers last year, mainly with Rwanda, which operates non-stop. So how can Cam Air compete with 4 weekly flights? Is it going to actually do effectively there? Perhaps more interestingly, it has only a very small number of connecting markets beyond Douala. So it will be more and more reliant on point-to-point. And again, is that going to work? And interestingly, it operates non-stop from Douala to Brazzaville, but via Point Noir on the way back. But why would it do this? Why operate triangularly like that, especially when the non-stop sector is only roughly an hour and a half duration?
Any
I
ideas
guess
on that,
it's
Sean?
because the gauge that they're putting into that market is just too large to serve one or the other on a non-stop basis. When your fleet consists of a menagerie of random wet leases and aircraft which are struggling to not be repossessed, you're pretty much stuck with half plane will fly and all right, I can't really justify 120 seats in this market, but I could justify 60, so let's combine it with something. And I think that is probably the only reason for this. Again, these are not data-driven network planning decisions. These are either edicts or half plane will fly kind of situation. It would be good to maybe have someone from Cam Air's network planning team here to discuss that someday, but that's just a pipe dream, perhaps.
Yeah, I imagine it. I imagine it is. I imagine their ears are burning right now. Okay, let's move away. I think every month for 8 months we've talked about Ethiopian in one way or another. They've done some pretty big things and some small iterations. But one that caught our eye was Ethiopian to open or to launch Warsaw from Athens, 16th of June, using the MAX. Now, this is super interesting, obviously, because there's no mention there of Addis as such. So talk us through this one. Sean, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Fine. I think it's interesting. We discussed this some months ago, I think maybe on the first or second podcast when we did this, was the fact that when Ethiopian placed an order for extended number of maxes, there was hidden in the fine print of that they were also looking for a new seat, which was potentially going to be certified for the 737 MAX. Now, of course, none of that has come to fruition yet. You don't just start getting new seats on aircraft overnight. But potentially that, at the time I mentioned, was a larger movement of the MAX into Europe. ET has been very reluctant to date to use the MAX into Europe for multiple reasons. One being the product, and they offer primarily overnight flights to and from Europe. So they pride themselves that their business class should have, if not consistent, because ET's product is anything but consistent, but at least should have reasonable long haul flatbed kind of seats for overnight flights. Athens was an exception to that rule because it's really a pretty short flight from Addis, just 5 hours, give or take. Extending that Athens flight to Warsaw is a very low-risk strategy. That plane sat for almost 20 hours in Athens anyway, so it's not like that plane was doing anything. They're just going to have the same aircraft, same crew, whatever, just fly that extra few hours north from Athens to Warsaw. So the risk to Ethiopian on this is very small, but it's a very interesting shift in that they are now using that MAX deeper into Europe on a regular scheduled basis. And I think that is going to be where ET's future expansion into Europe is actually going to come from. I don't see that they're maxed out in terms of, sorry for the pun there, but yes, they're maxed out in terms of the Londons, Parises, Frankfurts, Romes, Genevas, Zurichs, Milans, all the big hubs and the Viennas, all that kind of stuff. They're already flying to. If they're going to expand into these markets, they're going to now start having to look at secondary markets which they're currently serving with connections. Where they're flying into Vienna and connecting to Austrian Airways onwards, or into Frankfurt and onwards on Lufthansa, and now Warsaw and onward on LOT Polish. Those markets will now begin to open up with the MAX themselves. And if these kind of Eastern European marginal markets work, and again, as you mentioned, the OND is not to Addis Ababa. The OND is going to primarily be to the East African beach markets, which are currently served by the charters, whether that's going to be the Mombasa, the Zanzibar kind of thing. And yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic, but it's a very low risk strategy by ET going into this. And I think if it is successful, we'll probably see a lot more MAXs going into these markets with aircraft configured with the new seats. Probably my guess would be summer 26 onwards.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And I think for me as well, and a lot of the listeners, they'll be going, but how does this work? How have they got the traffic rights to be able to serve Athens and serve Warsaw? And what's next? As you say, it's the only logical explanation. What about from your side, James? You did a flight with Ethiopian last year, I think, didn't you? You did a couple of experiences with them. What do you think about this and their move into these secondary markets in Europe?
It's pretty interesting. I chatted to Ethiopian's Chief Commercial Officer, at the launch of their Gatwick service last year. And he said very clearly that Warsaw was coming. Obviously, it's a star-driven route with lot Polish. And he also said Lisbon, Amsterdam, Dublin and Prague, yes, also Prague, are going to materialize at some point. Some of those will be returning, but there's nothing to say more about those until they're announced. I think Warsaw is quite interesting. Obviously, it's completely time for maximizing African-bound flights. The market is not big. It doesn't need to be big. It's sharing it with Athens, and it's a fairly small aircraft, of course. Roughly 115,000 round-trip sub-Saharan passengers last year. Johannesburg, Seychelles, Zanzibar, Cape Town, Nairobi, the top markets. Yeah, I think I can see more. Again, Prague is meant to be coming, but it'd be very interesting to see if any other star-related routes might materialize in the future. And then the question is where?
Yeah, that's the big question. But where not, I think, may also be the question, because they're spreading their, especially as we said in the previous call, these new aircraft that they've got, the MAX offers, as Sean's explained really well, it offers the ability to serve markets that you couldn't necessarily serve it with the alternative equipment. All right, so we'll park Ethiopian there and we'll go to an airline that's very close to them, but based over in West Africa, which is ASky, based out of Togo. They published some big changes to their schedules. They're very much a sort of hub and spoke operation that they've got going on there. So talk us through this one, Sean. Like, what were the major changes and why do you think this was?
Well, we say it's major changes. The reality is it's changes at the margins. What effectively they've done is they've swapped up some of their routing. As you say, it's a very hub-driven carrier. If you're at Lomé Airport, every ASky flight, every single ASky flight for the day arrives in a 2-hour window, and every single ASky flight for the day departs in a 2-hour window. Other than that, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., give or take, with the arrivals and the departures, there's nothing. There's not a single ASky flight that lands or takes off outside of that hours. They have these 25, 30 flights that arrive, and Ethiopian as well. So Ethiopian has up to 4 aircraft arriving at that time. ASky has 13 aircraft arriving at that time. Everything happens in this window, and everybody then goes home for the day. So the interesting part on this is to improve the utility of their aircraft and also to get the economics right, because now they're flying a fleet only of 737s and they're going larger and larger. So they've gone from having 737-700s primarily, then to 800s, and now having a bunch of MAXs as well. And in fact, they've even got a high density MAX now with 180 odd seats in it. When you look at that, they can't actually make it point-to-point work from Lomé, even with all the hub feed they have. Some of these markets are just simply not big enough. But the yields are very good. So what they have done is they tag. So for example, they used to fly to Yaoundé via Abuja. So it would go Lomé, Abuja, Yaoundé, and they'd sell the Fifth Freedom traffic between Abuja and Yaoundé. What they've done is not as much change up the destinations they fly to, but change up the combination of some of these. So for example, Yaoundé is no longer going to be tagged to Abuja. It is now going to be tagged to, they were flying Cotonou Malabo in the past. Cotonou Malabo is no longer going to fly. As I said, Malabo now combines with Yaoundé. Abuja is going to become a terminator. We'd also mentioned, I believe, again, a few podcasts ago, that when Niger had reopened, Niger after the change of government in Niger had been subjected to a bunch of ECOWAS sanctions, where basically flights from ECOWAS, which includes Togo, were not permitted to operate into Nigerian airspace or into Niamey. So when Niger reopened, ASky really doubled down on Niger. They went in with a whole lot of routes and a whole lot of tag flights on it. And I think we're now seeing where some of that has changed. They were flying Niamey-Dakar, they were flying Niamey-Ouaga. Those have changed. We're now going to see, I believe, Niamey is going to connect with Cotonou and is going to connect with Bamako. And the Ouaga service is there, but that's going to be reduced. And I think it's interesting there because Ethiopian is increasing, the parent/sister company of ASky is increasing their Ouagadougou flights at the end of May, because they're adding a Ouagadougou to Freetown and a Ouagadougou to Conakry service on a 787 daily. And consequently, if you look at the flight timings on these, there actually is the potential, it's not going to be great in terms of connectivity or market size, but of connecting between ASky and Ethiopian at the Ouagadougou hub. and that it creates a little bit of network between ASky and Ethiopian of Bamako, Niamey, Freetown, and Conakry, all served from Ouagadougou between the two, all of which will have ET and KP codes on there. So it's interesting there. I think not earth-shattering by any means. We're talking hundreds of passengers rather than thousands of passengers a year who are going to be affected by this. But again, it shows the agility that someone like ASky has as a private sector professionally run carrier, which has the ability to say, look, this is not working. We've given it 6 months. It's not met our expectations. Let's look at the next thing, which might work or might not work. And if 1 out of 5 hits, they're success on it. And I think their core markets and their core strategy in terms of that hub in Lomé is strong enough that they have the ability to take a few losses in some of these experiments, as long as they're willing to pull the plug at the right time.
Yeah, and they've been traditionally pretty robust and pretty good at being profit-making and delivering a return to those niche markets. You must be interested by these guys, James. They're quite an interesting model, aren't they? And it's quite an interesting part of the world to provide this connectivity and the 737 only commonality on the fleet and things like that. So what are your thoughts on the airline and on these developments?
As Sean's saying, it's a massively exciting airline in one real way, and that's because of its hub structure. I'm not sure I can think of many others which only have one bank of arrivals and one bank of departures a day. It obviously means all of the aircraft are stationed elsewhere overnight, massively increasing costs, including crew and maintenance. But of course, that means connectivity is maximized. You'd be forgiven for thinking they could have another wave of flights a day, but of course, this is massively expensive. And it seems like their approach is, as Sean rightly said, is to increase aircraft gauge rather than increasing more frequencies to reduce CASK and improve economics that way. So I suspect it actually probably does reasonably well in terms of traffic and possibly even yields. And I really like the setup, very different.
Yeah, it's very smart for sure. Okay, fantastic. So thanks for your insight on those two. I'll stay with you on the next one, James, because we've got quite a big rumour mill section today, but we're going to look at some of the routes that didn't quite take off. One of which was Etihad, last minute having to postpone their launch to Nairobi. So we were trying to work out what happened. They blamed some sort of paperwork, or we're not quite sure. What was your understanding about what happened here?
I'm not entirely sure why they were postponed. First of all, they flew the route until 2021. It was due to come back on the 1st of May this year, but pushed back by a month to the 1st of June, if of course it's going to start then. Hopefully it will. In a general kind of way, it'll be a daily 320 CO operation, which begs the question, how on earth is it going to compete against Emirates double daily to Dubai with the 777, Kenya Airways 11 weekly with the 330, wet lease 330 to Dubai, Qatar Airways double daily 777 to Doha, and so on. Etihad isn't a massive operator in Africa. It only serves Cairo, Casablanca, Johannesburg, Nairobi, Seychelles, and of course Nairobi coming. Will it do well? I'm not entirely sure, but who knows? I like to think that it will, but fingers crossed.
Any inside info, Sean, on what happened here?
Everybody I've spoken to doesn't seem to know exactly what went wrong, but they seem to be linking it to the fact that they never got their operating permit in time. Now, whether that was due to someone at Etihad dropping the ball and not filing in time, or whether it was Kenya doing what Kenya is renowned for doing, which is dragging their feet forever on operating permits if they don't feel appreciated enough by the operator making the application through whatever means that may be. Or could be any numerous number of things. But the people at Etihad I've spoken to are not on the government affairs side, so they don't know specifically what it is. But it was down to the point that literally this flight was ready. Online check-in may even have been opened for that flight, for the inaugural flight. It was literally less than 24 hours prior to departure when the plug was pulled on it. So this was something that the aircraft was assigned, everything was a go. It was just said, nope, not going to happen. And as James said, this is not the first time they're trying this route. And it's not the first time that they've made aggressive moves into Africa. I remember flying on Etihad from Entebbe or Nairobi. They've tried a number of routes in Eastern Africa with the Airbus narrow-bodies, and they have failed absolutely pathetically and miserably on this. Etihad has been very aggressive in the last year or so. They've basically got a former TAP Portugal team. The team that grew TAP Portugal unsustainably by some arguments with narrow bodies and Brazil service in the late 2010s. A lot of that team is now over at Portugal, at Etihad now. Are we going to see the same story? Is this just an indicator of one of many markets which are going to be rushed into a launch without necessarily quite thinking them through, or is it going to be an actual resuscitation of that carrier? Numbers-wise, they seem to have done pretty decently in the last year, if the numbers are to be believed. They've got a nice new shiny terminal, which they've obviously got to fill up. The infrastructure is ready. If you build it, they need to come. So let's see where it goes. But Etihad's track record and their management team's track record on this kind of growth has not exactly inspired confidence that this route will be an overnight success.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not a great start, is it, with this particular route? I remember the days, of course, when they were expanding, when they were making equity investments into Air Seychelles and Air Berlin and all these other airlines, and Darwin Airline became a European sort of short haul carrier.
Etihad Regional.
Etihad Regional, exactly. And then it all shrank again, and now it seems to be that expansion. I see it all the time, new route here, new route there. But Africa generally hasn't been a big focus, as you say. We've never had much luck in Etihad coming to AviaDev, for example, and being actively involved in the route development there. Mostly North Africa, East Africa, and Northeast Africa, and then, of course, the big market down to Johannesburg as well. So very interesting. And while we're talking about, one more thing that we wanted to talk about before we get into the rumor mill was, you guys were discussing, we have a WhatsApp group to decide what we're going to talk about. And there was some really interesting feedback. Of course, we've talked about some of the countries that have had some political instability and changes and what that's done to airspace access. And of course, if you can't fly through that airspace for whatever reason, and you've got to route around, that adds so much cost to your bottom line as an operator. And it's something you've got to think about. So I want to get your feelings. There's a lot of this, obviously, in Central and Northern Africa at the moment, but the significance and the monitoring of the political situation to develop these routings, because if you open that route and then suddenly you've got to make a 3-hour detour, it changes all the economics massively. So, James, do you want to take this one and what you found?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm looking, while we're talking, on a different screen, I'm looking at Qatar Airways flying from Lagos back to Doha. And rather than flying the more obvious routing, it's currently over Algeria going to Tunisia. Then it turns right, avoids Libyan airspace, and then across through Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So that adds on probably at least a couple of hours of flying each way. And not only does it cost more, but it's also less competitive in terms of timing in GDSs and all the usual things. So opening up Libyan airspace will be very good, and also other airspaces which have to close temporarily or more permanently due to different conflicts. So fingers crossed, yeah, everything will be progressing nicely with lots of different positive benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sean, you've seen this too. This is a continuing trend and not a trend that we like to see.
No, it isn't. I think there's two huge chunks of airspace in Africa which are, if not necessarily closed, but significantly restricted, and that is Libya and Sudan. And the unfortunate point is that they are contiguous. So basically, all the way from Malta down to Addis Ababa, there's just two FIRs, two flight information regions, which is Tripoli and then Khartoum. And basically, both of these are no-go areas. If you are trying to get to anywhere south, well, between south of that block and north of that block, you need to go around that block. And this is where, as James says, Qatar is choosing to route their flights northerly. So going actually over the Mediterranean Sea, which is not where you think a logical route between Lagos and Doha would take you. But because of the winds, it actually isn't as bad as a couple hours of detour. It actually is faster to fly that route than it is to take the southerly route and go south of Sudan over Uganda. I know it doesn't really make a lot of sense that way, but it's just the way that the winds and everything go. Because if you look at that same route, when they fly from Doha to Lagos, they take advantage of the tailwinds and take the southerly route. And then on the way back, they fly up over the Mediterranean. So if you fly a round trip between Doha and Lagos, you're literally getting a tour of Africa, the Mediterranean, the Sahara, and the Arabian Desert. Quite a little tour of the region. But yeah, this is something that Qatar Airways in particular has been struck with. If you recall, for a long period, there were disputes between Qatar and the UAE and Saudi in particular, which restricted access to Qatari registered aircraft from their airspace. And as a result, Qatar Airways, most of their flights to Africa were being forced to take a very roundabout routing for multiple years. They worked with Oman to develop a new special air corridor that took them around Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I think that was a bit of expertise that Qatar developed back then because they had, and it's not just a case of cost. Cost is fine. Airlines like Qatar, cost obviously is not completely unimportant, but it's not a make or break for them. But what was critical for them, the fact that when you add an extra hour to some of these routes, your schedules no longer allow connections to your hub banks. So routes that would make sense if they were 8 hours out and 8 hours back no longer make sense when they're 9 hours out and 9 hours back because they no longer connect, say, with India or with Australia or with China or whichever other critical market they needed to serve. So Qatar really had to make a lot of come to Jesus or come to Allah or come to whichever deity of their choice their scheduling team was worshipping at the time and make a lot of difficult choices. But it was making those choices and the processes of that led them to make those choices, I think probably holds them probably in better stead right now than any of their other regional competitors who don't quite have the expertise of adjusting hub banks on the fly, of doing split hub schedules, which is something Qatar tends to do with a lot of their operations. I think we mentioned it when we mentioned their Luanda-Kinshasa operation, that if Qatar's coming into a market with 4 flights, they're very unlikely to put all 4 flights at the same timing. They're probably going to do 2 morning and 2 evening so that they feed different banks and have a wider range of markets with two-way connections. So I think Qatar's really got a very experienced scheduling team over there, and I think this probably affects them. It affects them a lot, but it doesn't hurt them as much as it could hurt a lot of the other carriers who, and you see this. You see it every time an airspace is closed or whatever. The story is rarely that Qatar Airways had a problem. The story is usually, a BA flight had to turn around because, I don't know, someone didn't want to fly over somewhere or something as such. So I think Qatar, Emirates, Fly Dubai, Arabia, these guys, the Middle East is a volatile area, and dealing with volatility is part and parcel of the game. So they know how to deal with this a lot better than some of the airlines in more stable countries. Yeah, I think it's sad that these are closed, but when they reopen, it's just going to be, it's going to help them consolidate a position rather than anything else.
Yeah, and let's hope that it does resolve itself and it isn't a case of you open one door, you close one door, another one opens, and you've got this sort of whack-a-mole issue. But we understand all of the geopolitical factors that impact our industry when it comes to route planning and making those long-term decisions. Thanks for your insight and intel on that. We really wanted to bring that up this month as something a little bit more of a deep dive. So let's get into the rumor mill. Let's have a bit of fun in the rumor mill. Some of the things that we found that we've heard on the grapevine. So let's start with our usual kickoff starter for 10. So Sean, Emirates, Nigeria, when are they coming back?
October. I know I said July last time, but I've now heard from multiple sources on the ground in Nigeria that they've told agents we're back in October. Flights are still not loaded, but by every account, it's going to be a daily 777 into Lagos from Dubai starting at the end of October with the IATA winter season. Take it to the bank. I'll put $10 on this one.
And why the delay?
I think the delay has primarily, as I mentioned last time, they've been waiting for 2 issues to largely be cleaned up. One has been in terms of systems to ensure that they can get their money out of Nigeria promptly rather than have it pile up in Nigerian banks in Naira and then lose 2/3 of its value by the time it's ready to be extracted. And the second part has been something which is already in motion, which is the UAE government reopening visa centers for Nigerians to obtain tourist visas to visit the UAE. The Nigeria to UAE market was over 500,000 passengers in 2019. That's down to barely 100,000 passengers last year. It's poised to explode once this reopens. Emirates are getting ready to do it, but are also very cautious because it's all well and good to have 500,000 people flying, but if you can't get the money for flying those 500,000 people, you might as well just stay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, James, second one for you. Really interesting for us at AviaDev as well that AirAsia have registered and are interested. They will be coming to Windhoek for AviaDev for the first time, making a foray into Africa and obviously having a look at the market. What do you think their intentions are for Africa? They're obviously a low-cost airline based out of Kuala Lumpur, generally, but they've got some interesting aircraft and they've got a potentially interesting business model that I suppose could work in the African market. How do you see it? What do you think they're interested in?
I kind of dismiss anything from Kuala Lumpur to Africa, possibly with the exception of Cairo. AirAsia X, for example, always every year they say we're going to fly to all these places all over the world, but nothing ever happens. Of course, we've had COVID, which paused different ambitions and things, but I don't really see much. That said, it is very intriguing, isn't it? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe you're best placed, given your communications with them, to talk about what their possible intentions are towards Africa.
Yeah, I think East Africa obviously makes the most sense from a geographic perspective, but I think rather than betray any confidences, and I haven't seen any of their dealings, but of course that does make sense. And they did actually have a press release that came out when Airbus were there earlier in the year that mentioned by name Nairobi and Cape Town as sub-Saharan destinations that they were looking to serve. But all I would say, James, is to agree with you that we see this stuff all the time and you don't necessarily have any credibility, add so like huge amount of credibility to it because these things are thrown out by PR teams left and center to create a bit of buzz. Sean, what do you think?
I think Kuala Lumpur to Africa is not going to be the market, but I think if you leverage the value of that Kuala Lumpur hub, and again, that is massive. They fly from Kuala Lumpur literally to every 2-bit airstrip in Southeast Asia. When we leverage all of that into Africa, you might have a business case. African travelers outbound, the traders and the like, they've been flying to the Bangkoks and Singapores and Kuala Lumpurs and stuff like that in China. China in particular, for many years. If you're cheap enough and you're offering good values on luggage and things like that, which AirAsia has a reputation of doing. This is not the €1 for a seat and 10,000 and your firstborn for luggage. It's 50 for a seat and 100 for the luggage, which traders are probably willing to pay. It's an intriguing dynamic. I think Nairobi, for lack of anywhere else, is probably makes sense as an East African gateway. What are your options? Uganda or Tanzania or the like? I think Nairobi is probably the best of a bad bunch in that respect. Cape Town, very different dynamic. Cape Town is probably going to be Australians going there and stuff like that. For the same reasons that I say Norse is choosing Cape Town right, I'd say they're choosing Cape Town wrong if they actually were to launch it. It's just too long a route to make sense when there's such a huge volume flowing over the Middle East at deep discount prices. That's a fairly logical connection as well. But yeah, it's intriguing. I'm not sure it's going to work, but I think if they bargain on Nairobi, look at the model of Indigo and what Indigo has done for the traffic in the India to Kenya market when they entered into the Nairobi market. It has gone absolutely through the roof. Hopefully we could see something like that happen if AirAsia comes in, leveraging the Kuala Lumpur hub into an East African gateway that has decent connections onward to the rest of the region and the continent. So fingers crossed, let's see. But until we hear an official announcement, I'm not going to put my money on it.
Okay. James.
Just to come back in, I agree completely. AirAsia X feeding AirAsia, that's very interesting. I just had a really quick look, purely on point-to-point traffic, nothing to do with connections. From Africa to Kuala Lumpur, the only big market is Cairo, nearly 100,000 passengers last year unserved. Nairobi, again, point to point, no connections, was 5,000. So you have, and it's a long route as well. So you have to wonder, does it make any sense whatsoever when 95% of your passengers would be flying somewhere else? But who knows? Maybe Cairo is interesting.
Yeah, and be sure.
If you fly to Cairo, why would you fly to Nairobi? Their press release said Nairobi. So, if your target is Cairo, fly to bloody Cairo.
Yeah, but their press release also said Manchester recently. So is that going to happen as well?
Yeah, and it's easy, but rest assured, obviously, if I can get them on the podcast when they've got something to say, then we'll put these questions to them and then we can dissect it.
I'm happy to do a panel with them at AviaDev if you want me to grill them.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd be very welcome, but they've got to be in a position with something to say. But of course, those who are coming to the event, they can ask this question and the AirAsia team will be there to take meetings with the airports. Go and, if you're an airport listening to this, make sure you put them in your meeting diary and we'll set that meeting up for you. All right, while we're in East Africa, I'm going to start with you on this one, James, but we saw news leaking out of Uganda that they were going to order some Boeings, so they've got a bit of everything. So I won't go to you first, Sean, but I will come to James first for this one.
Who knows? It's just getting ridiculous, isn't it? A tiny airline with multiple different types of aircraft is just a complete recipe for disaster, to put it politely. So I wouldn't really read much into the Boeing thing. Possibly more interesting for me is their temporary wet leasing of a 320. At least that fits between the CRJ 900 and the 330. Although, funnily enough, it's actually the world's second oldest active 320, which is something to write home about, perhaps, which is being used to Kinshasa, Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Lagos. But I don't really read much into the Boeing situation. I'm sure Sean, who is always very protective of Uganda Airlines, is going to comment.
Yeah, go on, Sean. You tell us what you think.
He's silent for once on Uganda.
Sorry, it had a satellite not receiving signal. So yes, I blame Elon. Yeah, I missed the end of what James was saying, but I pretty much know what he said. And yes, I think the 320 makes sense. The 320 is something that, whether it was a 320 or a MAX or whatever, something in that 4 to 5 hour range, 100 to 150 passengers. That's been what they've been crying out from day one. Yeah, look, the most interesting thing about the so-called order from Boeing has been that there's been not a word from Uganda Airlines and there's not been a word from Boeing. The only word seems to have come out of the president's office insisting that they have been instructed to do this. And much as presidents love to instruct, that doesn't always come to fruition because the president then has to probably pay for it. And Uganda does not have the money to pay for more expensive paperweights like they have with their A330neos. They're far better served looking at narrow bodies rather than having 787s and freighters and you name it. It was just like, I'll take one of this, two of that, add me a naan bread and a little bit of salad on the side. And yeah, that's Uganda Airlines for you. I feel sorry for them because there was a lot of potential. There still is a lot of potential. They have a decentish management team right now, but as long as the president's office, as long as Boeing comes to town and meets with the president rather than meeting with the management, that's always going to be the problem you're going to have.
Yeah, I think that's a wider point for sure. And we'll have the Uganda Airlines team with us in Windhoek. So we'll have the CEO, the CCO, the route development guys. Yeah, we'll all be there. So we can ask some of these questions for sure on the panel too. Because it's gone so well, Air Peace's flight to Gatwick, and they're so happy with everything that's going on there. There's a rumor now that they obviously want to launch Abuja to London as well. Now, Sean, is this going to be Gatwick again? Is this going to be they're going to try and get in somewhere else, which I think is highly unlikely?
Where else are they going to go? London Luton? James, Luton? You think that'll be good?
Not London Luton.
If they do it, it'll go into Gatwick. But the reality is you cannot simply make the economics of an Abuja to Gatwick work with a 777 like you can with the Lagos to Gatwick. Lagos to Gatwick is a humongous market, and it is Lagos to London. Lagos to the UK in general is a humongous market, and it's the constrained market. In that market, basically, there's only 14 non-stop flights other than the Air Peace flight, and therefore they're effectively, in a market of 500,000 people, they're offering a product that pretty much nobody else can because there is no fresh frequency from the UK side to compete with that. Abuja is a different ballgame. Abuja already has a British Airways daily 777 flight, and the market size is 1/3 or less the size of the 100 and something thousand passengers a year. The problem you now have is, number one, if you came in, say, 3 times a week from Abuja to London, you're not going to be competing on frequency. You don't have a network behind London like British Airways does. British Airways from Abuja is not just carrying passengers to London, they're carrying them to New York, Tokyo, Mumbai, and Sao Paulo. While Air Peace, while they have a network at Abuja, there's hundreds of thousands of people flying onwards from London to all those destinations, but there's maybe a few hundreds flying onwards to the Asabas, Maiduguri, Sokotos, and Calabars. It's not a market which is going to be easy for them to succeed in. Alan Onyema has the hubris that he might think he can succeed in it, but as I've always said, Airspeed specializes in ways of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, and starting Abuja to London would be a perfect way to have the Airpeace to the UK story that seems to be going so well so far ended absolutely enormous failure.
Yeah, and I think there is a political leaning here that, to show that you can put this flight on from Abuja to London probably does play a part in this for sure. And Alan's wider kind of feeling that he has this sort of mandate to do the nation building and be the national carrier for Nigeria as well. So feel free to add anything on that one, James, but I'll bring in as well, Uganda Airlines going to open Abu Dhabi, which is quite interesting. They're looking at doing this. Sean shaking his head, but thoughts on that one?
So the Uganda thing is very interesting. Again, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, if in fact it does. It would absolutely need to really dovetail properly with Etihad. It needs proper code share agreements and all of that kind of side. But at the same time, we're also discussing its own services to Nairobi and the different issues there. Will Uganda do any better to Abu Dhabi? Well, I don't think so. It seems a much harder fight to win. But in any case, it would be a brand new market, but it's very thin. And I don't necessarily, of course, with connections onwards, but I don't really see it happening or working.
You agree with that, Sean?
To fly to Abu Dhabi, they would have to cut their flights to Dubai. And quite simply, only a fool cuts flights from Dubai to instead relocate them to Abu Dhabi, even if you have a partnership with Etihad. You simply do not have... The O&D for Uganda is Dubai, not Abu Dhabi. There's a reason people flew there. There's a reason Emirates and Fly Dubai did well in the Entebbe market, while Etihad was a complete failure. Yes, the cities are 2 hours drive apart, but they might as well be worlds apart when it comes to the kind of traffic that Uganda is moving. If they launch Abu Dhabi, which they are not going to, let's be honest over here, this is once again a journalist asking a random person, do you have plans to launch Abu Dhabi? And they're saying, we're never going to rule anything out, kind of thing. Who the hell says, no, we're never going to do it? It makes no bloody sense. Your airport sucks. So no one is actually going to say that. And that obviously gets blown up into 100,000 different things. So it's not going to happen. Let's not waste our breath discussing it.
So in the same way then, the other one we had on the list, which got picked up by a few people, was South Africa flights to Thailand. That sounds very similar, that it was created probably over a glass of wine or six, that somebody had a conversation. And if you ask an ambassador, would you like flights to your country from your home country? They say, of course I would. And therefore, then that becomes a story if you want to spin it that way. Do you see anything outside of that with a rumor like that?
If you look at the yields between South Africa and Thailand, the numbers aren't large anyway. It's about 50,000 passengers, give or take, between all of South Africa and Thailand. But if you look at the yields, these are so horrendously awful. 0.04 cents per kilometer. Yeah. Wow. That's, yeah. No, that's... Not to say it won't happen, because both South African Airways and Thai Airways are both horrendously run airlines historically. So it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that it doesn't make sense for it.
Yeah. Any comments on this, James? You must see all this stuff being in the journalism game. You get these little sniffs every now and again, and very quickly you can think, oh, this probably came from a cocktail reception somewhere, or somebody had a slow day and wanted to create some news.
Absolutely. You hear these kind of things very regularly, don't you? I agree completely about the very poor yields and also the traffic, but maybe someone, when they were looking at the numbers, they said that Bangkok was Johannesburg's third largest Asian unserved market last year. So maybe it's an interesting opportunity. That's probably what they said. But will it happen? Who knows? I need to be convinced. I hope it doesn't in a way, because their Johannesburg Perth, which of course resumed recently, seems to be pretty decent, and it's a good opportunity. And hopefully they'll be slightly more sensible going forward with routes like that.
Yeah, I think we all agreed on the podcast, because obviously that launched only a few weeks ago. We all agreed that was a good idea and a good route to bring back into the network. But again, we also know that there's potentially change in the management team and the strategy and investment is still a conversation, and fleet is still a conversation.
In 2 weeks' time, there's going to be a new government there. Hey, everything is going to change.
Yes, exactly. And it becomes a pawn in the game. So the last one that I've got on my list, and I think somebody has been listening to the podcast, is Air Canada, which is really interesting, because this just came out of nowhere. But looking at Africa, Sean, and it's something that we talked about not that long ago.
No, and you know what? I think Air Canada have finally acknowledged publicly that the Africa to Canada market is growing exponentially. And as a professionally run business, they would be remiss by simply putting their head in the ground pretending it doesn't exist. Because if they don't take advantage of it, somebody else somehow is going to find a way to leverage it. Air Canada has traditionally not operated to Africa, and they have relied on their Star Alliance partnerships and the transatlantic joint venture to serve those markets. They have, however, in their investor presentation recently come out and said that with the advent of new aircraft types, specifically with the A321, so the larger narrow bodies, similar to what we discussed with potentially EasyJet and things like that, they will have the range to hit West Africa from Eastern Canada. And there are markets there, notably Accra, Abidjan, Dakar, which do have sizable O&D with Canada, and not just to the Montreals or the Torontos of the world, but beyond to the rest of Canada, where people struggle because of the need for US transit visas and things like that to otherwise connect on direct flights to North America. I will say one thing, which is that Canada, the Canadian government has historically been reluctant to commit flights into some of these markets with unstable situations. We've seen that with when Air Canada wanted to open Beirut flights some years ago and so forth. And Nigeria right now, stability or whatever being up for discussion, but Nigeria is the fourth largest source market for refugee claimants in Canada right now. I think that is something which will definitely, whether Air Canada is considering it or not, I think the Canadian government is definitely going to have that as a flag for themselves, because it is a sizable figure when you look in terms of the fact that there's no direct links between the countries, and yet there's so many Nigerians who are claiming refugee status and are winning refugee status in Canada. With the Canadian immigration situation right now, that is going to be a factor that plays into it. But as markets go, West Africa in particular to Canada is exploding. And I am very pleased to see the team at Air Canada, who I know also listen to this podcast, some of them do, have woken up to something that they've known for a while, but are just finally publicly acknowledging, and good for them.
Yes, I think it's a fantastic opportunity for them. And at the moment, they fly, obviously, with the French connection, Montreal to Algiers and Casablanca. So there's very good opportunities, I think, for them, including from their main Toronto hub. I think Dakar, Lagos, Accra could be very appealing, and maybe Dakar with the 321 XLR, the others perhaps with a 787. Who knows, in a few years, subject to air traffic rights as always.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that's everything for today. Is there anything that you guys have got on your list you want to get off your chest or that we haven't covered before I close up? No?
I think we've pretty much got everything.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sean and James. A really great hour spent listening to you guys. So thanks for all the effort that you put in collating the information during the month, which is a nice little team process, keeping everybody abreast in an hour of what's going on in the African market when it comes to route development. As I said at the beginning, make sure that you subscribe to James's newsletter, because it's really good. Obviously, it's global route news. We'd love to see some more African stuff on there, James. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But I'm sure that will come. And yeah, keep up the great work with all the analysis that you do. And thanks for that Turkish article as well, which we'll share too. Thank you, everybody out there, for joining us today. We hope you did enjoy the conversation. Help us spread the word and get this to more and more people's ears as possible, or onto their YouTube channels. Do share the episode, hit the share link, share it with somebody in your network you think would benefit from having a listen. Leave us a review, subscribe wherever you listen or watch, so we can be found by more people as well. And if we've missed anything, or if there's anything you'd like us to do a bit of a deep dive in, we may not be here next month simply because that is the month of AviaDev itself in Windhoek. It may be either a late June session or an early July session. But do get in touch with myself or Sean or James even directly, and we can obviously bring that to the fore for the next episode. But thank you all for spending the time with us. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll see you for the next episode very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.